About our forms and components. Yesterday we got some RESTful Tasks Interactive going. Let's open up this project again. So what I wanted to start out with is actually just talking about this concept of components. And a lot of front-end frameworks share this idea. You'll find it in React and Vue, which is the idea that we can create one component and use it in multiple different places. Okay? This idea of reusable components. And so I thought it would be a good way to just start things out today by just covering components in a brief fashion. We're not going to rest heavily on this, but let's think about what if I wanted to, I've got this little thing down here at the bottom of our main component, which is our app component, right? Where I'm just showing some selected task. What if I wanted to turn that into its own component where I might be able to use that in different places? Could I do that? Yes. So Angular has this concept of components. And if I make one, I could use it here and other places as well. All right? So let's see how we can make other components. We'll open up the terminal here, and we've got the Angular CLI, which is very helpful, right? We can use that to generate additional components very easily. So I can say ng generate component, and then, whoops, I'm not even inside the right directory. Make sure when you guys run this that you're actually inside your Angular directory, because notice how I'm just in the project root. Yeah. So let's cd into public, because otherwise your Angular CLI is not going to work. It's going to say you have to be inside an Angular project. So we'll say ng generate component, and we'll just call this a task component. All right. So notice here it's created some different files for us. It created the CSS file, the HTML file, the spec file, again for testing, and also the .ts file. Okay, so if we go back into our directory over here, notice how I now have this new folder, this task folder here, and if I open it up, I'm seeing all of those files that were just created for me. Okay? So what I'm going to do is actually take the code, or some of the code that we have in our main app component, and I'm going to put it inside my task component so that I can just treat that as sort of an individual item. Okay. So let's go down here and grab this code. So my selected task would just be all of this stuff, right? Or actually, I'm just going to grab all of this real quick. And then inside my this new task component that I just created, let's go to the HTML file and notice how it says TaskWorks. What? Yeah, do you want to, let's actually, before we do this, let me just put this into our HTML real quick. So the task component itself, if we click on the task component.ts file, notice how it says that it has a selector of app-task. What that means is that if I want to use this component somewhere else in my application, I need to use this as the actual HTML tag. I need to use app-task. Okay? So let me go to my app component.html, and I'll just include it somewhere. So we'll just go app-task. Save that, and then I need to start running these guys again, so hang on one second. Let me cd out here. We'll do nodemon server.js, and then I'll create my other terminal window to keep the Angular project running. Right? So you guys are always going to have a couple terminals running at the same time. So we'll say ng build -- watch. I believe we're on port 4500. So let's go over here, localhost 4500. Is that the wrong port? Yeah, probably. One second here. Okay, so here we go. So notice how here it's saying task works, right? So that was what we saw inside the task.html. So what that means is that if I change that code to my liking, we can also use it. So let's go inside the task component.html. Instead of task works, let's do something like this. And I don't really need this conditional right here, because if I'm showing this thing, that means that I have a selected task, right? So let me just pull this out for a second. Okay, we'll save that there. And now, what's going to happen here? So I'm going to open up my, my console so we can see what's happening. Uh-oh. What's the issue that I'm running in now? Same thing I was seeing yesterday, right? Title of undefined right here, because again, I don't have this selected task variable, right? So Angular components have this concept of inputs, which means that I can actually give the component some attributes that I want it to use in its HTML. So if we go back to our app component.html, what I want to pass to this app task is going to be the actual selected task, right? Okay, so let's do something like this. In order to pass this down, we need to put in square brackets selected task, and then I need to set that equal to selected task. Now, what's the other thing that I want to include here to make sure that I don't show this component if I don't have a selected task? You guys remember?
Is it the
ngIf, right? So we don't want to show it if our selected task is null. So I'm just going to paste that back in there. Oops. Okay. So now we're in pretty good shape. The only thing is that my app-task doesn't yet know that it has an input. We need to actually tell it that it will accept a selected task. Okay, so let me save that, and then let's go over to the task component. And up here, I'm going to say I have an input that is selected task. So I'll say at input, and then if I tab, whoops, why is it? Oh, there it goes. So when you tab, notice how it actually brings that in. So we're good. Go back here, and then I'm going to say, what is the name of the input that I'm taking in? So you guys remember what it's called? It's called selected task. Yeah, at least in this case. So selected task. Okay. All right, and let's see if we can get this guy working. So if I refresh here, okay, so now I have nothing. If I click on this, there we go. So it's actually working exactly the same way that it did otherwise. It's just that I now have this subcomponent that I could potentially use in different parts of my application. Okay, and if I wanted to style up that subcomponent in some way too, obviously I can do it in here. So let's just say, I'll call this container. Say it's got some padding in it. 30 pixels, border, 4 pixels solid green. Okay, now we just need to apply that to the task component, HTML here, so I'll just give it a class of container. Oops. Container. And then it won't work. Oh, yeah, it was working. Sorry. Jeez. So we're duplicating it because inside the actual app component, I must have left it in there. Whoops. All right, let's get rid of that, right? My bad. All right, so now if I refresh this here, we can very clearly see we have this subcomponent. All right. And that's kind of what I was talking about when we were talking about rate my cakes, which is that if we have an individual component for each cake, it acts as sort of an isolated environment for itself. Okay? So it can have a form inside of it which is just dedicated to that particular component. It won't interact with any of the other ones. All right, cool. Any questions about how we use inputs here? So just a quick review here. We just need to import input from Angular core, right? And then we need to invoke it using a decorator. See that @ symbol there? So that's something that's not available in JavaScript right now. But again, as we talked about earlier, sometimes we can use these extra features that aren't yet available when we're developing in TypeScript. Okay? We're using this input decorator, we're invoking it, and then we're giving the variable the name selected task. And then back here in my app component.html, let me close this out so you can see that a little bit better. We're saying ngIf, so if the selected task is not null, then we want to show this component. And we're doing some binding here, which means that we're going to bind the selected task that we pass down to the subcomponent to selected task, okay, which is a variable that we have inside our app component. You guys okay with this, or does this look funky? I feel like I'm seeing confusion.
I think you're explaining it well. I just have no idea
Okay. Is that how everyone's feeling?
Just a lot.
This just doesn't make any sense to me.
It's just,
messes all up.
I feel like it's been a steep ramp with Angular.
It's strange that we do RESTful tasks so many times and I forget the foundation and what we need each time we go through it. And we just kind of copy the whole project and build off that, and I've forgotten how it all started
Okay.
and what's necessary at the beginning.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. So this component concept is not going to be, I don't want to say it's going to be hugely important in the sense that you guys need to be creating subcomponents all the time. However, we are going to kind of revisit creating components again when we do routing, because each route is going to have its own individual component that goes with it. Okay? That's sort of the main thing. The main takeaway is that we can use the Angular CLI to create additional components. We don't just have to have an application that's just one component. Imagine how big that component might get if we did it that way, right? If we had no subcomponents, our app component could potentially become this monstrosity. It would just be incredibly difficult to maintain. This way, if we have subcomponents, if I just need to make a change to that selected that task component itself, and I don't need to make any changes throughout the app, it's pretty easy to work with, right? It's sort of a nice piece of isolated code. That's cool. All right. Cool. So the next thing that we want to talk about is forms. Because how do we typically take in some input from users? Through forms, right? Yeah, some kind of input device. All right. So if we're going to do that, we need to add another module to this file that we talked about yesterday. So we've got this app.module.ts. And right now we're bringing in the HTTP client module, right? That's so that we can make HTTP requests to our backend. Now we need to bring in this forms module so that we can actually use Angular forms. So let's do it down here. We do that inside our imports once again. So if I go forms module, and I hit tab, what? Why does that work for me sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't?
Try not completing it all the way.
Okay. Forms. It's like not even picking it up at all. Okay. So where do we get that from? Yeah, that sounds right. Forms module from @Angular/forms. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah, so the thing is that if you guys don't include this forms module, what's going to happen is when you try to submit a form, it's going to submit the old regular way that you've been used to. Okay. Yeah, it's going to do a hard refresh of the page and try to submit to whatever you set the action to do. Okay, so we don't want that. We want some kind of special form handling here. All right, so now that we've added that, let me close some of these files here. Back in our app component, let's go to the HTML and let's just create a little form where we can create a new task. All right. So we don't really need to worry about the action here. Whoops. But let's just create our input. So we've got a title and a description and a completed, right? So I'll go input group here, title. Okay. Actually, I'm going to keep going. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, now I'll do another input group. Description. Man. Okay, description, cool. So now the other thing that we want is we want this completed field, right? What kind of input do you think we should use for completed? Because it is a Boolean, right? It's either completed or not. Checkbox, yeah, that's a really good idea, right? So let's do div here, inside here, label, whoops, don't want that, completed, input, I can actually do checkbox like that. Have you guys used this syntax yet? Should be able to specify what kind of input you want. Yeah, that works. Okay, so completed. All right, so that's a checkbox. Then I always need a submit button, right? Oops, submit. Good deal. Let's just make sure that this is rendering on the page. So if I go back here, great, I've got my form here. So what I want to do first, before we even start worrying about the data that's going to be coming into the form, is I want to be able to handle a form submission. So how can I add some kind of a submit handler to this form? Parentheses submit, right? Just like we were doing with those click handlers. So I can go up here and I can say, when the submit happens, this is what I want to run, right? So let's just say, I'll call it submit handler. Oops. And then inside of our app.component.ts, let's just create a function which will handle this. So submit handler. Okay, and I'm just going to console log here. Form was submitted, like that. Okay, and let's refresh this page. Whoa. Open up my console here so that we can make sure that this is working. And I'm just going to hit return a few times here. Okay, so every time I hit return in one of these inputs, I'm submitting the form. And you can see that that message is printing down here in our console. Okay, so we know that our submit handler itself is working. Now the job is, okay, we want to actually see what the input values are, and then we want to pass those to our backend, right? Okay. Does anyone know how we're going to do this? Man, that was such enthusiasm. Yeah.
So you're going to be using a certain test.
Yeah, if I have to. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use something called two-way data binding. And this is kind of exciting because it means that the inputs can be changed not only from the inputs themselves, but I can also change them from my TypeScript file. Okay? All right. And the syntax that we use for this inside the template is we call it a banana in a box. And you guys will see why in a second, just from the way that it looks. Okay? It sounds kind of weird. I don't know. That's a good idea. That's a good question. Whose idea was this? Okay. So this is why it's called banana in a box, because we start with these outer square brackets, and then inside that we're going to have parentheses.
Yeah, it's more of a name.
And then inside there, we're going to say, what do I want my model to be associated with? So what do I want this input to be bound to? Dot title, is that what you said? It's a good idea. So what I'm going to do before I kind of finish this binding part is I'm going to go back to my TS file and just create an object that has sort of some blank inputs inside of it. Okay? And then I'm going to bind this to a specific key value pair inside that object. So let's go to our app.component.ts, and up here I'm going to say, we'll call this new task, and then it'll just be an object. So inside that object, I'm going to have the different input fields. So we'll say I have a key of title. Now initially I want the title to be blank, so I can say, it's just like that, right? It's an empty string. My description, I'm initially going to want that to be blank as well. So I can go like this. And then completed, we'll just set to false, right? So that should be unchecked. Okay, so now that I've got this object in here, I can actually connect our template to individual parts of it. So I can connect to the title, I can connect to the description, I can connect to the completed. So let's go back here. And we'll say, I'm going to bind this to new task.title. Okay? That means that if I make a change to that title property inside my app.component.ts, it would reflect in the HTML, and vice versa, right? If somebody changes it by just typing something in the inputs, the actual value of this is going to change in real time. Okay? So one way that you guys can kind of like see what these values are pretty easily is if you just output them to the template, right? And I've seen some of you guys doing this. This is pretty helpful. What if I just want to see what my form inputs are? I can say new task, oops, json.stringify new task. If I spell it right.
Platform recommends that you pipe new test.
Pipe it, yeah, let's pipe it. Forget about that. So we can use a pipe and just say, oops, JSON like that, right? That's so funny.
Connor's on the platform, please.
No, it's good. He keeps me in check.
Just kidding.
I depend on him heavily. All right, so all this is going to do is going to tell us what are all of our values as we're inputting stuff in, right? Okay, so let's save that, and let's continue binding these other guys. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to use the old banana in a box. And I'm going to say ng model for this one equals new task dot description. Okay. One thing I wanted to point out is that although we're not going to be using these name attributes here, you do need to include these name attributes for all your inputs. If you don't, you're going to get an error in Angular. Okay. But the actual data that we're interested in is going to be inside this new task object. Okay, so we'll come down here and we'll say the ng model for this guy is new task dot completed. Okay, so let's refresh this real quick. And notice how we've got everything listed up here, what our current state is, and if I start typing in here, notice how it's completely reactive, right? All of that stuff is happening live, a description. Okay, very good. And then if I change completed, if I check it, notice how that changed to true. So everything's nice. It's reacting on the spot for me. Okay, so when I want to send this new task to my backend, how am I going to do that? I'm going to use my submit handler, right? The submit handler is the thing that we're going to tap into and then just go make a request to our backend to the create tasks route. So let's do that. Inside of our submit handler here, right now we're saying form was submitted. We don't need that anymore. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our HTTP client, but this time we're going to make what kind of request? Not a GET request, right? A POST request, all right? Because that's our route. We have a POST route to create new tasks. So we'll say this ._HTTP client .post, and then the first argument that we need to provide is what is the route that we're going to. So we'll go API/tasks. And then the second argument is going to be the body of the POST request. All right, what do you guys think that body is going to be?
That form.
This guy right here, right? Because it has all the values from those form inputs that we want. Okay. So how do we reference it down here, though? Can I just say new task? Needs to be this dot new task, right? Okay. And then what else do I need to do? So I'm creating this. I'm making this post request, and what's that returning? We talked about it a little bit yesterday. An observable, right? So in order to kick that observable into gear, what do I need to do? I need to subscribe to it.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah, let's both like and subscribe. Smash it. All right, let's subscribe to that. Whoops. And then what we're going to get back is some kind of data, right? Now, what am I going to do with this data? So I've got this list of tasks up here, which again started out as an empty array, and then after I retrieved them, now it is my actual tasks, right? So what do I want to do once I've created a new task? Might I want to update this tasks list here?
Yes.
So how can we do that? Let's just push it. Now in my case, I'm sending back an object that has a property inside of it called task, which is the new task that I created. So I would do something like this.tasks.push, and then we're going to say data.task. Uh-oh, I got this red again. You guys remember what that was all about? So it's just telling me property task does not exist on type object. Okay, so it doesn't know anything about that data object. It doesn't know that I've nested my task inside there. So again, to get around that, we can use that escape hatch if we need to. Okay. Any questions about this right here?
So give me an example for the
Platform.
sorry, never mind. Okay, so
What? They're in cahoots over there. All right. Let's let's just give this a try here. So let me refresh the page. What tasks do you guys want to add? Let's come up with something here.
Finish strong.
Master Angular. On the
By
way.
end of day.
Yeah, by end of day goal. All right, so let's open up our console so that we always kind of keep an idea or an eye on what's going on. Let's click the submit button. Wow. Did you see how fast that happened? So already our new task was just pushed onto this array of tasks, right? Did anyone think that was not going to work? It seemed like there was some doubt there. Because before we talk about services, which I wanted to bring in here, I know that's been causing some confusion as well. I just wanted us to make sure we can actually just get a form submitting, sending a request to the back end, successfully getting a new task, and then pushing to our list of tasks. Does this code make pretty good sense to you guys?
It makes complete sense to me. I just thought there's a lot of steps in order just to render a form. It seems like it's a lot easier than other stacks. Maybe it's just because it's different. I'm not sure. But it seems like there's a lot of steps to take.
Yeah, there was a little bit more involved. First of all, we had to add the forms module.
Yeah.
The other thing is we needed to use this two-way data binding, which meant that we created a new task object here. All right. And then in the template, we had to bind to specific properties in this new task object.
And why is it significant that it updates in real time? Like I know that's. Is there a reasoning behind that, or just?
Well, it's significant in the sense that you can create a very sleek user experience, right? We can do real-time validations. We can do all sorts of things. We can show them what they're typing on the
I
spot.
see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. That's so like in the way that like when you're typing like into a password thing, it'll continue to say. It'll be read until it'll say like password has to be 5 characters, and once you get to 5 characters, and they pop up and say and needs a symbol. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's sort of constant. We can be running validations constantly. Okay. All right, Ryan, I want you to go through line 38. Let's just talk about what's happening here.
That's cold-blooded. So you have a function called submit handler. Correct. Then you have a curly bracket, and that curly bracket. Yeah.
All right, so that's just introducing the body of the function, right? Okay,
And,
fair enough.
and you have some nice indent, and it says this dot underscore HTTP client dot post. So what you're doing there is you're making a post request to API/tasks.
Okay, this is our route. Good.
And you're passing this new task. That's the body in which the form exists, lives, and dwells in.
That's going to be the body of our request. So it's just like if we go back to Postman real quick. It's just like this, right? It's an object that has all the key value pairs that we're trying to submit here. Okay, cool.
I thought that was biblical.
That was good. It's like we got our writing essay.
All right, excellent. So we did this part, right? We actually ran this post request, and that's going to return what to us? Remember?
Our object, our data.
No, specifically, what is this going to return when I run this, when I invoke that function? Think about observation.
Observation.
Watching things.
Yeah. I said observation.
So the term is observable. It gives us back this special object, which is called an observable. Okay? Okay, now we're doing something with that object that we just got back, right? So what's happening here on line 39?
It's basically the task, the data is being pushed back to data.task. So it's basically updating our information.
Okay, so when we subscribe to that observable, it means that we pass in a callback function that we want to run once the data has been returned. Okay, it's kind of like when our promises resolve. Remember how we would attach a callback function using .then? Very similar here, right? So we know that we're going to get some data back, and then all we're going to do is we're going to say to our current tasks array, let's just push this new task that I just got. All right. Excellent. All right, any other questions about this part before we talk about maybe migrating out to a service?
Can you explain the this.new task part again after the route? The second parameter post. Oh, at the bottom.
Oh, I'm sorry, down here, yeah. Oh, okay, cool. So this is the body of our post request. Just like when we're inside Postman and we want to provide some data here, this is our body for this request, right? Okay.
You're still on that post request, what you want, what part you're updating,
What data am I passing along with my post request?
So that's gonna
Because
have
because obviously we can't just send a post request to that route with no data, right? I can't create a task if I don't have some task data.
so the strings are inside that this.new task. So the information.
So this that new task, yeah, it's this object that has these different key value pairs inside of it. Right.
So the post doesn't carry that info. It's the this.task that carries it.
Correct. Yeah. So the first argument here is just the route that we're trying to make the request to. The second argument is the actual data that we want to send along with our request. Okay, and I keep going back to Postman, but this should help kind of make it make sense, which is that we're doing a post request to this route, and then this is the body that goes along with it, right? Okay. All right, cool. So what if I had a bunch of different components that were trying to do things with tasks? Wouldn't it kind of make sense to have a piece of code or a part of my application that was just handling doing HTTP requests, right? We can actually abstract this instead of doing all of this stuff, like the heavy lifting inside the component. We can create what's called a service that will be in charge of interacting with our backend. Okay. So you guys who are in services, how do we actually create one of these things?
ng generate service.
ng generate service. Okay. So again, if I open up another terminal window here, I'm not inside my Angular project, so I need to get into it. So cd public. Okay, and then we'll say ng generate service, and I'm going to call this service HTTP. Okay, notice here, again, the command line, the CLI is helping us out. So it generated the service.spec file. This is a testing file. And then it also generated the http.service.ts for us. So let's take a look at that. So inside our HTTP service file, we're basically going to want to bring in all of these different methods that we had of interacting with tasks. So we can have inside here, let's get all of our tasks. We can maybe get a task by ID. Probably won't do that today, but we can also create a task inside here, right? Okay. So what do I need to bring into this guy to be able to make this work?
HTTP client.
Yes, I need to bring in my HTTP client. That's right. Exactly. So inside my constructor here, I can say private, and we'll say underscore HTTP client, and it's going to be of type HTTP client. So again, if I press tab, I get that autocomplete up there, which is quite nice. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, mine has
Selenium.
Stop that.
Supposed to be add Angular common
Common slash HTTP. Whew. Man, that's absolutely terrible. All right. Yeah, so apparently there's a subdependency of Angular that's kind of getting in the way of this. Bummer. All right, cool. So let's just create a couple methods inside here. We're going to have one where we get all of our tasks, and then we have another one which just creates a task. All right, so let's say get all tasks. You guys remember what this method looks like? So what do I want to do inside here? I'm purposely not going to go back to the other code just so that we have to think it through a little bit. No.
Trying to make the
So I now have this HTTP client, right? How do I make the request to actually get all of my tasks?
This underscore GTP file.
Okay. Dot get, and we want to make the get request to API/tasks, right? Now, what do I want to do with this?
return it.
What is this going to return me again?
So
An observable. So if I return it from this function, that means that wherever I'm calling get all tasks from, I will now have access to that observable, right? And which means that I can then subscribe to it. All right, so let's just return this right here. Okay, now if I want to create a task, I'll say create task. What do I want to take into this method? An observable?
What's the new task?
Yeah, the new task, right? Exactly. So I'll take in a new task, which will be an object, right? It has those key value pairs. And then I'm going to, instead of making a get request, what kind of request am I going to make this time? A post request. All right, so we'll say return this dot underscore HTTP client dot post. So same route here. And then the second argument is going to be what? New task. Exactly. Okay. Now there's one other thing that I need to be able to, or need to do in order to make this service available throughout my application. You guys know what it is?
inject it.
Well, yeah, I'll have to inject it actually wherever I'm using it, in whatever component I'm using it in. But where else do I need to include it?
New components.
I need to include it in my providers array. Yeah, this is very easy to forget too.
That's registering, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're registering it, making it available app-wide. So let's go down here, and we'll say HTTP service. Okay, notice how this time my auto import worked the way I was expecting. So I press tab after I type that in. Now we'll be able to inject this. We'll be able to inject the HTTP service into whatever component needs to use it. Okay, so let's go back to our app.component.ts. In order to use this, as Anthony said, I need to inject it, which happens here on line 20. So inside this constructor, I'm going to create some space here for readability. So in addition to the HTTP, actually, in lieu of the HTTP client, what am I going to inject this time? The actual service, because we're not going to use the HTTP client directly in this component. We're just going to use the service to interact with our backend on our behalf. So let me get rid of that, and then we'll say this is going to be the HTTP service. HTTP service. Okay, notice how it imported it up here for me. Do I need the HTTP client anymore? No. Okay, but what changes do I need to make down here? So now that I've gotten rid of my HTTP client, how do I change these guys? Find and replace. Yeah, that's a good call. All right. So instead of doing this, what we want to do is we want to say HTTP service, and then what's the name? We have a couple different functions here. I've got get all tasks and create tasks. Which one are we going to use? Get all tasks. Okay. And again, what that's going to return me is going to be that observable, right? so I can still subscribe to it. And then how do I need to change line 40 here? Because here we were using our HTTP client, which we don't have anymore. So what am I going to do here? HTTP service,
And the other one.
Or create,
create task, right?
and then task the new task.
This.new task, right? Okay, cool. So again, that's still going to give us an observable which we can still subscribe to. So it's just that small little change. And it might not really make great sense to you guys right now. Why are we even dealing with services if the application is so small? Well, what if we had a much larger application where there are a number of different types of requests that we can make to our backend, right? We might want to consolidate that stuff into a service like this so that everything was standardized. So let's go back into our page here and make sure this still works the way we're expecting. I'll refresh that here. Let's add a new task, some new task, some new description. I'll say this one's completed. We'll submit that there. So that's still working, right? It's still getting all of my tasks in the beginning, so I know that part's working. So those two things are still good. So all I've done is I've sort of migrated some of my code out of the component into a service, which standardizes everything for me. Okay. And all that stuff's still working too. Any questions about the services component? How many people are in services right now or have gotten to it? Some of you guys?
It starts first, doesn't it? The service and the platform.
Yeah, I think it's pretty early on. Yeah, when you start dealing with HTTP calls. Okay.
RESTful testing.
All right, cool. Any questions about everything that we covered today? So forms and components.
Are we gonna go over the update?
The what?
Update.
Oh, the update. Yeah, we'll do that in the author's demo. Yeah, so it's coming. We'll do, in the author's demo, essentially we'll do basically everything you guys need to know for the test.
That's not.
What? That's what you're talking about? I think that's why that is typically such a helpful lecture. All right.
We're doing that this evening.
No, that's tomorrow. Today, let me just stop the video.